Okay, so let's unpack this. We have just an incredible amount of source material here on a case that I think really goes beyond any normal definition of true crime.
It really does.
We're talking about the O.J. Simpson trial,
Yeah.
a legal spectacle that didn't just, captivate America, it completely fractured it.
It's so often just filed under, celebrity scandals, but that completely misses the point. It misses the profound structural impact this thing had.
Exactly.
It was a moment of, I think, a true national reckoning.
And that's our mission today. The sources we've got define this not as just a murder case, but as, and I love this phrase, a mirror held up to America. So we're going to try to move past that exhausted debate of guilt or innocence.
Right.
And instead, we're going to extract the sociological, the legal, the historical insights to really understand why this trial is still, it's the blueprint for modern justice, for media, for race relations.
The documents we have are pretty clear on this. The trial was a cultural supernova. It exposed these tectonic plates of American life that are usually hidden. We're talking race, power, celebrity, and maybe most critically, the limits of the justice system itself when public trust is just gone.
We all know the basic timeline, right?
Yeah.
June 12, 1994, the brutal murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman in Brentwood, which leads to this 11-month legal saga, the trial of the century. But the context, the atmosphere of Los Angeles in the early 90s, that's everything.
It's everything. If you don't grasp what was happening in that city at that time, the eventual verdict is just inexplicable.
So that's where we have to start.
That context is our absolute starting point. Right. So this deep dive into the trial, it has to start as a deep dive into Los Angeles on a knife edge.
Okay, let's begin with the man at the center of it.
Right.
Before the murders, Orenthal James Simpson, he was arguably the most successfully integrated celebrity in America.
He was a genuine American icon. The sources are definitive about this. He was a Heisman winner, an NFL legend. He was an actor. He was the guy running through airports for Hertz.
Everyone knew him.
Everyone. And he represented this idea of success that was achieved completely outside the perceived constraints of race.
And that image, what our sources call America's OJ, was seen as being fundamentally post-racial.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, that's the term they use. He was a black man who was so thoroughly embraced by white America that his race, to many white observers, just seemed incidental.
So why is that specific detail, his sort of institutional privilege, why is that so important to the story that unfolds?
Because it insulated him.
Yeah.
The sources really emphasize this. O.J. Simpson enjoyed a level of institutional privilege and deference that very, very few black men in America, and particularly in Los Angeles, ever got to experience.
Right.
So when the trial began, the defense had a huge task. They had to take that post-racial figure and completely resituate him squarely within the experience of black America as a victim of a corrupt police state.
And that's where the context of Los Angeles becomes, just devastatingly relevant. Because his privilege, this bubble he lived in, it crashes right into a city that had been structurally damaged and was, still reeling from this massive trauma.
Precisely. You absolutely cannot talk about 1994 without first talking about 1992.
The riots.
The trial began just 3 years after the Rodney King beating and the explosion of the LA riots. Los Angeles was, to use the term from the sources, a pressure cooker. The city wasn't dealing with some abstract racial tension. It was dealing with the immediate, raw aftermath of a civil revolt.
Let's go deeper on that, on the institutional failure that led to the riots. Our sources cite the findings of the 1991 Christopher Commission. What did those findings actually reveal about the LAPD that, fueled all that distrust?
The Christopher Commission was set up right after the King beating, and its findings were, frankly, they were damning. It documented widespread systemic abuse and excessive force within the LAPD, especially targeting minority communities. It showed that segregation and economic disparity were rampant, and it found that a significant percentage of officers routinely used derogatory language, racial slurs, and applied force without any justification.
So we're not talking about just a few bad apples here. This was official documentation of systemic structural problems that went from the street level all the way up.
Absolutely. And the physical evidence of this hostility was still there. One source notes that the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the very place where the trial was held, was still bearing visible graffiti from the 92 riots.
Wow.
So that systemic distrust, it wasn't hypothetical, it was a tangible, raw wound. And the defense team, they recognized that this context was their ultimate weapon.
So Johnny Cochran and his team, they didn't have to invent the idea that the LAPD was corrupt.
No, not at all.
They just had to tap into the collective memory and this documented institutional failure that the city itself had already confirmed.
That's the key structural insight. The groundwork for their entire defense strategy was laid years earlier by the city's own commissions and the tragic aftermath of the King verdict. When the state put O.J. on trial, they were in effect putting the entire history of the LAPD in that city on trial with him.
And before the courtroom drama even kicked off, the entire world got a taste of the surreal spectacle that was coming with the famous Bronco chase.
Oh, yeah. The sources defined that chase on June 17, 1994, as a live, unscripted national trauma. It was this bizarre moment where the lines between news, sports, tragedy, and entertainment just completely evaporated.
It was so strange, right? The low speed, this white Bronco just cruising down the freeway, Al Cowling's at the wheel. What was the scale of the viewership, and why does that number really matter for the rest of the trial?
The specific detail is just staggering. 95 million viewers watched that pursuit unfold.
95 million.
95 million. I mean, think about that. That's larger than the viewership for the Super Bowl in many years. It was this fusion of tragedy and tabloid TV that did two things at once. First, it cemented O.J.'s status as a genuine megastar, and second, it revealed the public's absolute unquenchable thirst for constant, real-time drama.
And that thirst, I guess, it just perfectly set the stage for this intense emotional collision between highly technical evidence and this overwhelming societal distrust.
Which brings us right to the legal heart of the case.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, the trial was defined by race and spectacle, but its technical core really revolved around the concept of reasonable doubt.
Right.
And that doubt was built not just on police corruption, but on the fragility of forensic science at the time, and the prosecution's just stunning overconfidence in their physical evidence.
Okay, let's get into the science. The prosecution, they really believed the DNA evidence was, like, irrefutable. What was the state of DNA back in the mid-90s?
In 1995, DNA evidence was still considered the gold standard. That was largely thanks to new advancements in what's called PCR testing. The statistics were compelling. I mean, the probability of the blood evidence belonging to someone other than Simpson was just incredibly low.
But the public, and more importantly the jury, they were still kind of grappling with what these tiny numbers actually meant, right?
Yeah.
It was new, it was high-tech, and it was probably pretty easy to misunderstand.
Precisely. And that powerful new science tragically collided with profound procedural sloppiness. Because the science was so complex and supposedly definitive, the LAPD investigators approached the evidence collection with a stunning degree of overconfidence and really poor protocol.
And the defense team, the dream team, Cochran, Shapiro, Bailey, Scheck, they specialized in exploiting exactly that procedural vulnerability.
But that was their entire game.
So they weren't trying to refute the statistical certainty of the DNA itself. They were focused on undermining the integrity of the entire process that got the DNA into the courtroom.
Their strategy was brilliant, and some would say cynical. It was. If the means by which the evidence was collected is corrupt or sloppy, then the evidence itself has to be discounted. They argued successfully for reasonable doubt based almost entirely on evidence handling errors, on contamination, and just general mishandling.
Okay, let's get specific on those lapses. The sources focus really heavily on the controversy around the blood samples.
Right, so the sources highlight this really controversial point involving the vial of blood that was drawn from O.J. Simpson for testing. A vial with about 8 milliliters of blood was collected, but when the forensic scientist Dennis Fung logged it, the defense argued that a critical 1.5 milliliters of blood was completely unaccounted for.
Wait, 1.5 milliliters of his own blood was potentially missing. What was the implication the defense drew from that? How did they sell that narrative?
Well, the defense suggested that the missing blood was used by the LAPD to plant traces of O.J.'s blood on key pieces of evidence.
Such as?
Namely, the gate at Nicole's condo and inside the white Bronco. They leveraged the police department's failure to properly account for every single drop of that sample to suggest deliberate tampering.
So it almost didn't matter if the blood was truly planted or just, lost to sloppy record keeping. The procedural lapse was enough to create the doubt.
Absolutely. The defense brought in these world-class experts, most famously Dr. Henry Lee, and his testimony just created this appearance of total forensic chaos.
Right.
And Lee's famous comment that something is wrong with the evidence chain, when you combine that with the missing blood, it made the conspiracy narrative palpably real to a jury that was already skeptical.
So the core lesson the trial delivered to the legal world was what our sources say. Procedural mistakes can override substantive truth.
The chain of custody became more important than the genetic code itself.
In this foundation of doubt, built on flawed procedure, it provided the perfect groundwork for the ultimate piece of courtroom drama, the one that completely overshadowed all the statistical data. I'm talking about the gloves.
The glove moment. It's still probably the most recognized piece of legal theater in history, mostly because of that unforgettable line that sealed it.
Set it up for us.
Prosecutor Christopher Darden asks O.J. Simpson to try on the bloody glove that was found at his Rockingham estate. Simpson struggles, visibly, to pull it on, and then Johnny Cochran delivers his immortal summation. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
And that visual was just devastating for the prosecution.
Yeah.
But the data, the forensic facts around that moment, they're so often completely obscured by the performance. Let's unpack the lesser-known truths our sources reveal.
Yeah, there are three main factors that contributed to that failure to fit. First, the sources note the gloves were leather. And wet leather, especially when it's dried and improperly stored as evidence, it shrinks significantly.
Okay, so the state inadvertently sabotaged its own evidence just by handling it poorly.
That's part of it. This natural process would have made the gloves smaller than they were when they were first worn.
What about the human factor in this?
Well, the second and third points relate directly to Simpson's actions and his physiology. Experts noted that during the demonstration, Simpson may have been wearing latex gloves underneath the bloody gloves.
Really?
Yeah, it's a common practice to protect the evidence, but it's one that would have intentionally made the fit harder, maybe even impossible.
So a layer of latex beneath the leather. That's a deliberate action designed to influence the outcome.
It could be. And third, there's this highly specific physiological detail that the sources highlight. Simpson suffered from arthritis.
Right, I've heard this.
He was allegedly instructed by his defense team to stop taking his prescribed anti-inflammatory arthritis medication around the time of the trial. Arthritis causes hands to swell, so ceasing the medication would have exacerbated that swelling, ensuring his hands were as large as possible specifically for that courtroom demonstration.
That is just a masterclass in courtroom manipulation, a trifecta of environmental shrinkage, potential tampering with an inner layer, and a physiological change, all converging to create one single, powerful visual narrative that just screams innocence.
And the prosecution was completely blindsided by the visual impact. The jury saw a struggling celebrity, and that immediate visceral image, the glove not fitting, that was the narrative that stuck.
Yeah.
It effectively proved that in our adversarial system, performance can absolutely outweigh data.
The failure of statistical evidence to overcome that emotional, that narrative persuasion, it leads us right to the massive sociological chasm. This case just blew wide open. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was, as the defense framed it, a trial of the LAPD, and by extension, the entire American justice system.
This is exactly where the issue of race moves from being context to being the catalyst. The polls that were taken right after the verdict revealed a truly stark divide. I mean, an overwhelming majority of Black Americans believed Simpson was framed, while a similar majority of white Americans believed he was guilty.
It's like they weren't even watching the same trial. They were interpreting the exact same evidence through fundamentally different historical lenses.
Exactly. This schism wasn't just about O.J.'s individual fate. It was about history. It was about centuries of shared trauma and what sociologists call collective memory.
Okay.
For Black America, O.J. Simpson became a stand-in, a proxy for every anonymous person who had ever been wronged, harassed, or abused by a law enforcement system they perceived as fundamentally corrupt.
So the idea of a police conspiracy, it wasn't a stretch for many of the Black jurors. It was an affirmation of a lifetime of experience, an experience that had just been confirmed by the Christopher Commission and the Rodney King aftermath.
That's the perfect definition of positionality. The sources confirm it. One's perception of guilt or innocence in this case was overwhelmingly predicted by race because of this historical positionality relative to law enforcement.
So for many Black Americans, the acquittal wasn't a belief in his innocence, but a rejection of the state's moral authority.
Precisely. The LAPD was effectively the defendant, and they were facing a long overdue reckoning.
And the defense was just handed the absolute perfect, undeniable piece of evidence to fuel that collective memory in the form of one detective, Mark Furman.
The collapse of Detective Mark Fuhrman's credibility was seismic. I mean, just world-shaking for this trial. Fuhrman was the officer who found the critical bloody glove at Simpson's Rockingham estate. He was a key link in the prosecution's chain.
And the defense knew they had to establish that if Fuhrman was willing to lie or plant evidence, then the entire investigation was irrevocably tainted.
And the sources detailed this astonishing revelation. Fuhrman was caught on audio tape using the N-word a staggering 41 times while speaking with an aspiring screenwriter named Laura Hart McKinney.
41 times.
41. But it wasn't just the slurs. The tapes captured Fuhrman talking about police brutality, about fabricating evidence, and expressing satisfaction over police violence against black citizens.
So that goes way beyond simple racism. That's concrete evidence of the very institutional corruption the defense had been alleging from day one.
It absolutely did. The tapes weren't just character assassination. They were evidence that the conspiracy theory was rooted in a documented reality.
Right.
So when Fuhrman was recalled to the stand and he invoked the Fifth Amendment about whether he had planted evidence, the defense's theory became, as the sources say, palpably real for that jury. His perjury just destroyed the state's moral and legal credibility in the eyes of the court.
And this created a central legal strategy that we have seen repeated ever since.
It established what became known as the Fuhrman Principle, the idea that documented police misconduct, perjury, and systemic bias can fundamentally invalidate the state's entire case, regardless of the weight of the physical evidence.
So a lesson was learned across the country.
Challenge the integrity of the institution, and the facts themselves can become irrelevant.
Let's focus on the jury itself for a second, because they were the ones who ultimately had to decide how to apply this principle. They were sequestered for an astonishing 265 days.
Almost 9 months.
Almost 9 months. They were predominantly black, and they undeniably reflected the LA community's experience with the LAPD.
That sequestration process is a critical factor that people often overlook. Being isolated for that long, it creates a unique social dynamic in the jury room. The sources suggest this isolation, combined with their collective community memory, it pushed them toward a cohesive identity that was centered on the injustice they perceived.
And this leads to that academic theory of jury nullification, which many legal scholars applied to this verdict. Unpack that for us.
Jury nullification is when a jury deliberately chooses to ignore the evidence or ignore the judge's instructions and acquit the defendant. Not because they necessarily believe the person is innocent,
But because
they are using their power to reject the application of a law, or in this specific case, to indict what they see as a broken system.
So the verdict, under this theory, reflected a rejection of the LAPD's history, rather than, say, an absolute consensus of Simpson's factual innocence.
That's the core contention, yeah. Legal scholars still debate whether an act like this ultimately harms the rule of law, or if it actually upholds the spirit of justice by holding the institution accountable.
It's a tough question.
In this specific context, the jury was sending a message that one guilty man going free was an acceptable price for rejecting the state's moral authority and its historical actions. The verdict became a political statement.
And the time it took them to decide, that supports this interpretation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The acquittal was swift. Less than 4 hours of deliberation for a trial that had consumed the entire nation for 11 months.
Wow. Less than 4 hours.
That speed strongly indicates that the fundamental question in that room had shifted from, is there evidence that OJ did it, to, can we trust the system that gathered this evidence?
And their answer, in less than 240 minutes, was a resounding system-wide no.
And the moment that verdict was read, we saw that immediate simultaneous schism. Half the country cheered the rejection of institutional corruption, and the other half just gasped in horror at what they saw as a complete failure of justice.
And that shockwave, it fundamentally changed how media, celebrity, and justice would intersect forever.
And those aftershocks are still defining our culture today.
We have to explore the profound structural changes this trial kicked off, because this is where the relevance for anyone listening today really crystallizes. The O.J. Simpson trial didn't just use the media platforms that existed. It fundamentally created the media landscape we now live in.
It was the blueprint. It was the absolute blueprint for the convergence of modern news and entertainment.
Let's start with the birth of the true crime media complex. I mean, this trial normalized the live, gavel-to-gavel legal spectacle. It proved that the public had this insatiable appetite for following trials in real time, which set the template for the true crime obsession we see everywhere today.
And it was more than just normalizing true crime. It established the 24/7 news cycle as a viable, profitable business. The sources document the record-breaking ratings CNN got during the trial.
Right.
And this constant need for content, the need to fill airtime between witnesses, it necessitated the introduction of perpetual talking head analysis.
And that pivot from, reporting facts to just broadcasting opinion and speculation, that became the structural model for modern cable news.
It absolutely did. The public's addiction to constant updates, to expert speculation, to emotional analysis, it proved to be a massive commercial success. It directly led to the launch of competitive networks like Fox News and MSNBC in 1996.
Both of them capitalizing on this blend of news, opinion, and spectacle.
The cynical lesson that the networks learned was crystal clear. Crime sells, especially when race, celebrity, and high stakes all intersect.
And it also taught a pretty devastating lesson about justice itself. That money buys a narrative that can often overcome evidence. This trial really previewed the modern era where immense wealth and professional PR teams can create an almost parallel justice system.
One that is completely inaccessible to the vast majority of defendants.
Right.
The defense team was costing anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000 a day.
Wow.
Per day.
Per day. That kind of expenditure allowed them to hire forensic experts who could challenge every single piece of prosecution evidence and to have a dedicated PR strategy managed by professionals. That's a legal advantage. It's beyond the average person's access to justice.
It effectively showed that the best defense isn't always the truth, but the ability to generate enough doubt and manage public perception at the highest possible level.
And we can't ignore the bizarre pop culture irony that the sources all highlight. The Kardashian empire was launched directly from the periphery of this case.
It's incredible to think about. Robert Kardashian, OJ's friend and one of his defense attorneys, he became a national figure, and that thrust his family into the spotlight. The trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. In retrospect, it was a foundational moment in the rise of celebrity culture's dominance.
But if we move beyond the celebrity gossip, the most significant and enduring legacy has to be how the trial set the script for analyzing institutional bias.
Absolutely. The structural questions of police credibility, institutional racism, differential treatment, all the things that were forced into the national spotlight in 1995, they didn't go away. The sources argue they echo directly in modern movements and debates, from Ferguson to George Floyd and beyond.
So the trial really provided the necessary language and the analytical framework for discussing these high-profile cases through the lens of historical racial trauma.
The Furman principle is still a core defense strategy. And the necessity for police forces across the country to demonstrate meticulous evidence handling, the very thing the LAPD failed to do, that became an established standard. The trial forced major policy and structural reforms in LA and other big city police departments about internal affairs and evidence collection.
So even if the details of the case itself start to fade, its impact on law enforcement procedure, on media consumption, and our national conversation about race is indelible.
It is. But to fully understand the trial's legacy, we have to reconcile the two legally sanctioned outcomes. We have to confront the conflicting verdicts and the competing legal theories that emerged from the exact same set of facts.
And you're referring to the overlooked verdict, the civil trial. This is a critical distinction that so often gets lost in the public memory of the case.
It's essential. It's essential because it presents a different kind of legal truth. The 1997 civil trial, which was filed by the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, sought monetary damages. And in this trial, a new, different jury found O.J. Simpson liable for their wrongful deaths.
And this required a completely different standard of proof than the criminal trial, right? How did that difference lead to such a dramatic change in the outcome?
So in the criminal trial, the state had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest burden in law, and it's designed to prevent the state from wrongfully imprisoning someone.
And the prosecution failed to meet that burden.
They failed, largely due to the procedural issues and the Furman problem.
But the civil trial had a much lower hurdle to clear.
Far lower. The standard was preponderance of evidence, which basically means the jury only had to believe it was more likely than not, more than 50% probable that Simpson committed the murders. With that lower threshold, and without the police misconduct defense being quite as dominant, the financial judgment was swift and decisive.
The result was a $33.5 million judgment against him. This outcome perfectly highlights the I guess, the inherent fragility of legal truth. It confirms that a criminal acquittal does not equal factual exoneration.
Exactly. It simply means the state failed to meet its highest legal burden. It also showed how the defense strategy had to shift. In the civil case, which was about money, the race-based arguments and police conspiracy theories that worked so well in criminal court held far less weight. The focus shifted back to the direct timeline and the forensic connections, which a civil jury found convincing under that lower standard.
This dichotomy leads us right to the two main scholarly views our sources present about the ultimate meaning of the verdict.
On one side, you have the legal scholars, who represent the sort of mainstream view. They argue the verdict was legally defensible, but purely on procedural grounds.
So not that he was innocent, but that the prosecution just failed.
Exactly. They were overconfident, they mismanaged the forensic evidence, and they lost strategically. They allowed the dream team to win on technicalities.
And then there's the powerful counter-argument from critical race theorists.
They argue that the verdict was a symbolic, justifiable act of resistance, that it was less about O.J.'s innocence and more about the collective decision to use the legal system to indict a legacy of corruption. They view the outcome as the system correcting or at least pushing back against historical injustice.
It's a profound conflict. A failure of legal procedure versus a success of social symbolism.
And in the vortex of this massive legal and sociological debate, one crucial element of the tragedy, perhaps the most critical element, was just tragically marginalized and lost.
What's that?
The issue of intimate partner violence.
Right. That's the part of the narrative that so often gets ignored because it was so effectively sidelined by the defense's focus on Furman and race. The victims, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, were rendered almost secondary to the political drama.
Absolutely. The sources provide a really scathing critique of how the legal proceedings just failed to prioritize the context of domestic violence. The powerful central theme of years of abuse, including Nicole's 1989 911 call, where you can hear O.J. raging, plus photos and diary entries documenting physical harm, all of it was largely eclipsed.
So how exactly did the defense so successfully divert attention away from Simpson's history of abuse and toward Detective Furman's history of racism?
It was a strategic masterstroke by the defense. They successfully framed the revelation of Furman's racism and his perjury as the central overriding truth of the case.
Right.
By making the LAPD the primary villain, any focus on O.J.'s history of violence against Nicole was reframed by the defense as either a distraction or, even worse, a justification for the police conspiracy. They argued the police hated him and were out to get him because of his life choices.
So the issue of systemic police brutality, while obviously vital, it essentially consumed and silenced the issue of systemic domestic violence.
It was a heartbreaking outcome for so many advocates. The trial tragically marginalized Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, turning a case about profound interpersonal tragedy into nationwide entertainment and a debate about institutional failure. It showed the system was structurally unprepared to handle the dual crisis of race and gender violence at the same time.
And the race narrative just overwhelmed the abuse narrative.
It did. And that lack of accountability for the abuse history, despite the civil verdict, is a major element of the case's enduring trauma. The sources remind us that the relentless, dignified pursuit of justice by Ron Goldman's father, Fred Goldman, in the civil courts, it underscores the moral distinction between a legal acquittal and factual moral truth.
So after dissecting the context, the legal mistakes, the sociological schism, and the lasting media fallout, what are the ultimate strengths and dangers that this trial imprinted onto the American psyche?
The sources provide a really clear distillation. The strength of the trial was undeniable. It forced a crucial national conversation on race, police bias, and justice that was long overdue. It forced issues of systemic corruption into the highest levels of public discourse.
And on a technical level, it dragged flaws, like improper evidence handling and contamination, into the light, right? Which forced major police reform efforts regarding forensic protocols in LA and across the country.
For sure. However, the danger side is perhaps more corrosive to public faith. The trial dramatically reinforced the idea that justice is a commodity. It demonstrated graphically that overwhelming wealth can fundamentally distort the legal outcome.
It also permanently normalized trial by media.
It did, where narrative, spin, and public opinion can supersede objective evidence. And worst of all, it fostered this deep, often paralyzing cynicism about the legal system's ability to arrive at any universally accepted truth. It confirmed that there are two Americas, operating under two different sets of rules and perceptions.
So the O.J. Simpson trial endures precisely because it was just so much larger than than the crime itself.
It was simultaneously a trial of the American police, the American media, and the American dream. It showcased how incredibly effective narrative persuasion can be, even when it's facing a mountain of forensic data.
It forces us to ask these tough questions about whose truth prevails and why that truth is always filtered through the lens of historical distrust.
The sources we looked at offer a really powerful final assessment. The O.J. Simpson case is often labeled as unresolved, but legal historians argue it's actually unfinished.
Unfinished, not unresolved. What's the distinction?
The trial reminds us that justice is not only about facts, it is about trust. And when that institutional trust fractures, even the strongest evidence struggles to be heard. You get verdicts that serve political or symbolic ends rather than a universal consensus.
And that leads us to the ultimate, unresolved question that this trial posed on October 3rd, 1995. A question that remains just as urgent today. Can a justice system that was born from profound historical inequity, a system that historically marginalized vast segments of the population, can it ever earn the universal trust required to be seen as truly just?
Whose justice and for whom? That's the profound foundational question that continues to shape our discourse decades after that verdict was read.